I said really quickly then, my email address right in the bottom right-hand corner. If you need it at the end, I can also give it as well. As I was saying was you really have to start this conversation off with defining what a personal statement is. And that is largely due to the fact that it's very intuitive what a personal statement is. It seems like it's really obvious, it's clear. But like I mentioned, when you go back and read people's personal statements, a lot of times they maybe don't include all the information they should, or maybe it's really not a personal narrative, but just a copy of their resume. And it shouldn't be that. That's why I think we should go through and see all the different components. And then afterwards, I'm going to give you guys a bunch of advice and tips from my own experience to help you. So I actually got this definition off the internet that I thought was a good general explanation. So as you guys can read, it says a personal statement is an account of your achievements, talents, interests, and goals, often included in a job or university applications or on resumes. A personal statement is really important, and I would actually go so far as to say that I think it's one of the most important components of not only an application, but one of the most important components of your entire academic and even sometimes your professional career. Now, why do I say that? I say that because not only have I had to use a personal statement for every single university application that I've submitted, but I've had to use one for every single scholarship application I've submitted, fellowship application I've submitted, even program application I've submitted. Every program I've tried to get into and even gotten into, whether it was some academic program or professional program, I had to submit a personal statement. And that just speaks to the importance of a personal statement because they are used and they are required in a lot of different types of applications. So it's not only just a university application, which is why I think I would actually encourage all of you to always be constantly working on a copy of a personal statement at the end of every year. And why do I say that? Well, because when you're applying for those scholarships, you're applying for those programs, it's always good to just have a personal statement up to date and handy, and then you can further refine it and edit it later so that you're ready to go. And so a personal statement really is universal in a lot of different applications. And so that's really important to highlight here, is it's not just for your university application, it's for a lot of different applications. Now that we kind of know what a personal statement is, what is the purpose of a personal statement? Why the heck do admissions teams want us to submit one? Why would a program, a scholarship program, want you to submit one? Or maybe even a job opportunity, why would they want one from you? Well, as we saw, and as I mentioned, a personal statement takes your resume and takes your application a step further. It is you making your case and telling a narrative or a story. And that's really important because your narrative or your story will highlight different things. It's not only going to highlight all of your achievements, but it's going to highlight your challenges. So things that you've overcome, things that you've faced, to then, and as a result, better demonstrate your uniqueness. And by uniqueness, what I mean here is your achievements, your goals, things that you have done and achieved already and succeeded in, maybe some different programs you participated in. So those two go hand in hand in telling your narrative because they're very specific to you. So, if somebody won whatever, like XYZ scholarship, not everybody's won that. And so that's a very specific and unique kind of thing and item to you. And those are the kinds of things you want to be thinking about when you're crafting your personal statement is, okay, should I include this or should I include this? What should I not include? What should I include? Aside from the narrative, which is the more general point, as you can see from the outside, a little bit deeper into the thing is another part is your interests, your passions, but also not only your current passions, but maybe you see some opportunities in the program, So say I'm applying to a mechanical engineering program at, let's say, UCLA, for example. Well, maybe UCLA, in comparison to all the other amazing universities that offer mechanical engineering programs, has a specific fellowship program or a shadowing program that allows me to work directly alongside a few of the faculty and staff. And that is an opportunity that I've recognized, and I think it would be really important for my development, both academically and professionally. Well, that's something that the admissions teams wants to know. They want to see that you've recognized and you've done your research and you've identified opportunities for yourself in their program. And that goes to show not only your interest in general, but it shows your interest for the specific program that you're applying for, your motivations, kind of, so to speak, as well. And so it's really important that you identify those kinds of opportunities because they want to see that so that they can better understand, well, is this person going to be a good fit for our program? Do all the things that our program offers, do they kind of stand to benefit from all of those things? And so that's a question you should be constantly keeping in your mind and asking yourself. And then lastly, kind of at the core is your motivations. You know, a personal statement is telling your story, but at the end of the day, it is basically a succinct narrative of your motivations. Why are you applying to us? What has motivated you to go into a mechanical engineering program at UCLA and not at the University of Florida? Why here and not there? Why this, not that, you know? Those are the kinds of things that the admissions teams are asking themselves, and they're asking of you. And so that's the purpose of a personal statement, is to answer that very general, but also sometimes challenging question, because it can be really hard to put into words what you've done and why that qualifies you to be a strong candidate for whatever program you're applying to. And so that is why I encourage all of you to take the opportunity to attend these kinds of workshops and everything else to better understand what a personal statement, an effective and strong personal statement looks like. So your motivations, like I said, they can be opportunities. So some of those opportunities really just include professional development. Maybe you see an opportunity or you're motivated because of the professional development opportunities. Maybe it's to lead you to a job. So, you know, maybe this program is a stepping stone to a future career that you have set out for yourself. Those are the kinds of things you need to be asking yourself and doing, because that's also important. They want to see, and they obviously know that this program is not going to last forever. It's a temporary portion of your academic career, and just a little drop in your entire life. And so they want to know, what is the purpose of this program? Why? What is it going to lead to for you, etc. So just something to take into account when you're thinking about why you're writing your personal statement. So my first bit of advice. So like I said, basically the rest of this presentation is bits of advice and a few little exercises to get you guys to kind of do things yourself as well and see things a little bit clearer. I included a bunch of different pieces of advice for you guys to think about and also use when you're writing your personal statement. Now, I think this first one seems a little bit strange because you guys are probably all thinking, well, Vlad, obviously, if I have to create a personal statement, I have to write. And I know it maybe seems counterintuitive for me to say, okay, you guys need to write. But this is not just write. What I mean by this, and the reason I've capitalized this, bolded it, put an exclamation mark at the end, and put it even in red to stand out to you guys, is some things that I have done in my experience that have helped me. And when I've gone to seminars and writing workshops at my university, and I've talked to advisors, one of the best pieces of advice that I got was, when I'm beginning to write my personal statement for whatever program, I need to just write out all my thoughts. I need to flesh out all my ideas. I need to just get them out. Because normally, if I read a prompt or whatever the requirements are of me, I begin to already limit myself because I'm thinking, okay, what should I write and what should I not write? And so then as I'm writing, I'm filtering all the information that's coming through my head, and I might not necessarily be writing down everything that I would like to. And so my first kind of recommendation and kind of point of encouragement for you all is to write down all of your thoughts. Literally anything and everything, just whether you're typing or writing, just go. Just get out all of those ideas, because that's important for a few reasons. A, you now have something to begin with. So you're not just sitting there staring at a blank screen or a blank page because you have writer's block and you don't know what experiences to include, what to write. So now you at least have a bunch of information. Even if it's not the best information yet, you have something. And so you can use that as your base, work on it, build on it, refine it, edit it, etc. It's also important because it just lets you really get out all your ideas. You'll be surprised when you're just writing, your brain kind of switches onto a creativity mode. And it just, when you're free writing, it's a lot different. And the work that you produce is a lot different from when you're actively writing, but thinking and filtering that information, you know? So those are two different styles of writing. And while you'll use both styles in the process, I always recommend you to begin with the free writing style and just get out any and all thoughts that you could possibly have. And so I found, I don't know if you guys have seen Finding Nemo, but I thought this meme was great because it's just keep writing, just keep writing. I mean, Dory says just keep swimming, but in this case, what I want you guys to do is just keep writing. Just write for as long as you can, and write down as many things as you can. Don't be worried if it relates to the topic or not. You can cut out anything afterwards. Nobody's going to see what you write. You could literally write random sentences, but at least you have written something, and it gets your brain already stimulated and going, which is great for the process because then you find yourself starting to think more and including other things that you maybe forgot about or whatnot. So definitely something for you guys to do is write. Second point is, in the kind of general grand scheme of things, is active voice. So active voice is something that I almost am certain is in every language. I know it's in English, I know it's in Russian, and I'm going to safely say that I am almost certain it's also in Kazakh. Almost every language has active voice and passive voice. Now, this is one of the biggest mistakes I see in a lot of personal statements, not because I'm reading personal statements all the time, but because I used to make this mistake. I think a lot of people, especially in high school, sometimes make this mistake. And so that's something to take into account. People who are applying for graduate programs, this is especially important because you're already at the end of your undergraduate time or have already completed it. And so this is something they already expect of you. And this isn't something that you should just now kind of technically be learning. But again, we are here to help you. And so that's why we're doing this, is to make sure you guys don't make these mistakes. So active voice. What is it? What does it look like? And you'll see here afterwards, I've included just 2 example sentences of active and passive for you guys to see. But active voice is important for a variety of different reasons. And we want to employ active voice because it really engages our audience. It makes us seem like the doer of the action rather than something else doing the action, and we're just kind of there witnessing it. So if it's the difference between me saying like I do something versus something happened to me, because just saying something happened to me doesn't necessarily mean I wanted to do it or I took initiative, leadership, And so it's really important that you guys use active voice. So what I want to do first is have you guys read through these 2 examples. I kind of touched upon this, and this isn't supposed to be difficult. This is rather easy. But tell me which example is active voice and tell me which one is passive voice. It's not really hard, actually. Active and passive voice is really easy, and yet it is something that people forget to include in their personal statements. Not that they forget to include it, but they don't use it as much as they need to, and they might be using passive voice a little bit too much. And you want to avoid using passive voice, especially in a personal statement, as much as possible. That doesn't mean that you can never use it, because there are definitely times you'll have to use passive voice, but active voice should be like 95% of the time, for sure. So example 1. I wrote, I understood that the longer term goal of my education is to be advising and influencing American foreign policy. So you can see I am the one doing the action, and I did something that's concrete and there's detail. That's perfect. This tells someone exactly what I was doing. Whereas the second one, where I say, and they both mean the exact same thing. The second one says, my education allowed me to understand that my longer term goal is to advise and influence American foreign policy. They both literally mean the exact same thing. And to kind of a untrained eye, I think somebody would say, well, what's the difference between the 2? Why can't I use the second one and not the first one? And it's not that you can't use the second one, but the first one is more effective in telling a story. When you tell a story, there has to be action, there has to be excitement, there has to be engagement. And you want to engage your reader so much that once they're done reading your application and they're discussing with the rest of the admissions team, they say, wow, I'm going to always think now, when I think of this person's application, I think of the time they said XYZ, because they put so much action into it and it makes it memorable. It makes a personal statement that is unforgettable. And that's your goal. You want them to remember your application because it was so well written. And same thing for your personal statement. So a tip, one thing I recommend for you guys to do, and this is something that I do, this is something my advisors and my professors have always had me do, is At the very end, when you're getting ready to submit your thing or you're in the revision process, probably do it in the revision process. When you revise, go through and highlight every single sentence that is passive, so that is in the passive voice, and see if you can change it. You don't have to change all of them, but do try to put it into the active voice and see, does it maybe sound better? 9 times out of 10, it probably does. And B, it probably is more effective in saying whatever you're trying to say, because it has just more voice, it has more action and everything else. But like even in these examples, so I use Donna because I'm just going to pick on Donna here, but Donna proposed items on the agenda that would be discussed in the meeting. The items in the agenda that would be discussed in the meeting were proposed by Donna. So obviously here, there's still action going on in both of them. But in the first example, Donna's doing the action. And so when I'm reading, I'm thinking, okay, Donna proposed. She's proposing things, she's putting out ideas. Maybe that's a leadership quality. She makes sure that everybody knows what her input is, what her opinion is, what her thoughts are, and stuff like that. The second one, on the flip side, you see that there's action, but it's really the action is the items that are being in the agenda that are being discussed. Even though it says were proposed by Donna, again, you guys know passive voice, it doesn't really put Donna in the action role. She's really just kind of there, kind of on the side. And so that's something you want to think about, is when you're creating this narrative, you're painting a picture for individuals. And the best way to paint a really effective picture is to use action words, active voice, because then in my mind, I kind of imagine a story, especially for visual readers. They imagine the story in their mind when they read your paper. And that's what you want to do, is give them that story, give them that opportunity. So again, biggest tip is use active voice as much as possible, especially in a personal statement. That I cannot stress enough. I touched upon some of these, but some of the reasons you want to use active voice, I have 5 reasons, clear and simple reasons. 1, it's concise. So a lot of times when you use active voice, it actually reduces the length of the sentence. So it makes you use less words, but say the exact same thing, and that's effective. But yeah, so what I was saying was concise. It's brevity is what we're going for. Not that you don't want to include details, you want details, but you don't want to have some super long sentence that just goes on forever because you're using the passive voice and it has a bunch of unnecessary words and details that we don't need. We want to be to the point, because when you're concise, then as a result, and the second point is, you're more engaging. You're going to engage your reader much more, and they're going to understand who you are as an applicant much better. Third and fourth points go together. They're very similar, but it results for a faster narrative, which means since there's less words or they're more direct, you can read it faster. So the story, the development happens quicker, and that's a good thing, because these people are reading thousands of essays. And imagine on your 1000th essay, when you're reading an essay, you're probably sitting there like thinking, oh my God, like I've read so many essays. I'm so tired of reading essays. And so help your reader out. You want to do them a favor. Make sure you give them a narrative that is easy to read. And a faster narrative is obviously easier to read. So they're not having to go through one sentence that lasts 3 pages. And lastly, and this is just a side benefit, is it prevents errors. And what kind of errors? Well, grammatical errors. Because when you write in the passive voice, people, and I was looking this up as well, and I know this from my own experience, when you're writing in the passive voice, you're more prone to committing grammatical errors than you are in the active voice. Why? Because the active voice is really simple. It's the subject, it's the verb, and then it's the direct and perhaps indirect objects. And that's it. Whereas those things all get flipped in the process when you're doing the passive voice. And sometimes in the passive voice, because unlike other languages, I would say English is a little bit more structured with sentence structure, so the order of things. And so since passive voice has to flip the structure just a bit, English is still a pretty rigid language sometimes, and so you might commit a grammatical error. And you don't want to have grammar errors, especially when you're applying to a program. Let's say you're applying to like literature. How are you going to make the case that you're a strong writer if you have grammatical errors in your own personal statement, which you're supposed to edit and revise and have all the time to do, So that's something that's just really important for you all to take into account. My second piece of advice is less is more. So I just kind of touched upon this, but what I mean by less is more is when you're writing, for example, in the active voice, as I mentioned, you use less words to say the exact same thing. And that's effective writing. And that's strategic writing, because you're limited in how long you can write. You can't turn in a 1,000-page essay, nor do you want to, because nobody wants to read a 1,000-page essay. I mean, you might be the most interesting person in the world, and yet nobody's going to read every word of everything you're going to write, most likely. And so, to make for an easy read, we want to take the less is more approach in our writing. And that doesn't mean write a shorter essay. It means use more concise and effective / strategic sentences. And so what that looks like is not using a bunch of unnecessary flowery language that maybe just you can lose the reader in. Instead, you want to be very direct, say exactly what you're trying to say, and get to the point. I don't want to have to read halfway through your paper just to finally understand what you're saying. That's not an effective paper. I know they had a webinar, I think somebody hosted a webinar for you guys about your opening statement or that hook sentence. And those are a great way also because a hook sentence is obviously you want to catch the reader's attention and you want to be very direct. And your hook sentence shouldn't be something that goes on forever and ever because you lose the reader already from the beginning. But you take that same idea throughout your entire paper. Just like your hook sentence, you don't need to have a hook every single sentence, but what you do need is something that's constantly engaging the reader. And if your sentences are too long or too kind of convoluted and watered down with so much language, unnecessary language specifically, then it makes for a much more difficult read. And like I said, you want to make this an easy read for whoever's reading it. Make them think, oh, wow, what a great writer. This person knows exactly what they're doing. So an example of this, but this is to show you what this looks like in practice, because you guys might not know really what do I mean by a less is more approach, because I don't want you guys just to go and now start cutting out all of your sentences. Don't do that. But think about how you can write more effective sentences, So for example 1, we have a sentence. It's okay. It's not bad. But it says, her life had spanned many years of incredible change for women as they gained more rights and freedoms than people had previously seen. So this sounds like she was probably living through times of change and what she viewed as positive change because women were gaining more rights and freedoms. But there's a lot of words here for one sentence. One thing I would recommend when you're writing these kinds of sentences to help you understand the less is more approach. In my business communication course, they told us that a sentence around 20 words is an ideal sentence. It's not too short, and it's not too long. And it's a perfect length for you to still be able to include detail. Now, that doesn't mean every sentence has to be less or more, barely more, because some sentences are going to be 25 or 27 or 28 words. But reduce those kinds of sentences or break them up. Use semicolons, periods, all of those things are your friends. And you don't want to have too long of a sentence like this, because this is actually a pretty long sentence. It took me like a good few seconds to read that. But the second example, as you guys can see, is she lived through the exciting era of women's liberation. That says the exact same thing. And do you see how much shorter this second sentence is compared to the first one? And it says the exact same thing. And she mentions that it's exciting. So change, especially incredible change, probably is an exciting time. Rights and freedoms, women's liberation, that means the exact same thing, And so this is what effective writing looks like in practice. It's taking those sentences that might be unnecessarily long and crunching them down, reducing them to much shorter sentences. And that's what you guys want to aim to do. Now, don't try to make all your sentences just like 8 words or 9 words. Remember, I said an ideal sentence probably is 20 words, but some can be less, and that's fine. Some sentences will be shorter, and if that's what you need to be direct and to the point, do it. So the tip here for the less is more approach is, and the focus really is on action verbs and strong word choice. So as I said, I'm not recommending you to simply cut out details that might be necessary, because you might need those to tell your narrative and to effectively and strategically tell your narrative. But what I am saying is think about what words you're using. Have you said something in 5 words when you could have said it in 1 word? If so, what is that one word that you can be using and should be using? And I know English is not your native language, so this is very difficult to do in a foreign language. However, again, you guys are applying and up against a lot of different candidates. And so I want to make sure you guys are as best prepared as possible. And to do so, one of the kind of resources and tools that you need to leverage is strong word choice. You need to choose words that really describe and encapsulate what you're trying to say in a less is more approach. Because then, again, easy read for the reader, it's concise, it's quick, it's direct, and somebody knows exactly what you're trying to say. And then they understand so much more about you. Because if you have a bunch of sentences like example 1, and if all your sentences are like example 1, by the end of your personal statement, I might be so confused as to what I read that I really can't concentrate on what you were trying to tell me, what your achievements were, what your motivations were, what were those challenges you experienced, So don't convolute the whole paper with super long, unnecessary sentences. Keep it to the point. So, like I said, action verbs. Action verbs and strong word choice are really important. And to be able to use strong word choice, action verbs are your best friends. At my school, we actually have something, at my university right now, we have something called the Career Center. And the Career Center is amazing because they have a bunch of resume workshops, cover letter workshops, etc. And on your resume, they normally want people to include action verbs. But I would take it a step further, and you also want action verbs, obviously, in your writing. Because action verbs are better than just saying, I do, I go, I think, I saw, I understand. It gives a lot more meaning and action behind what you're trying to say, and it engages the reader better. So I actually took a screenshot of, my business school, the Career Center for my business school, they have each major. So like they had the business intelligence and information technology major, and they have a bunch of different action verbs right here that are commonly used and that really demonstrate types of actions that people would do if they're going to be involved in this kind of field of study. Same with communication. The list is really long. Like have this list, these kinds of lists actually right next to you when you're doing your writing, especially when you're going back and editing. Because when you first write, you might use simple words, and then you can use those action verbs, and that makes your paper 10 times better. The link I included is from my business school, so all of the majors there are really business school majors, but you can easily go onto any kind of university's website, and they will have other fields of study and majors, and have lists like these to help you. Like I said, I can't obviously include all the words in one slide, and I didn't want to. Because I don't want to give you guys a billion words and have you guys all just stare blankly at them. But this is to show you what kind of resources are available to you guys. This is a great way for you guys to really take your writing to the next level. And this is something you should do, because 9 times out of 10, people are just going to write and they don't think about what words they're using. And strong word choice, as we saw, is everything, because it's going to make your paper easier to read, and it's to the point, and that's what we want. And I don't want to read 1,000 times of I do, I went, I participated in. You start to use the same words, and then it becomes what we call redundant, meaning it just feels like it's repeating over and over again, saying the exact same thing. And you want to have variation. You want to be diverse in your approach, and you want to change up the words you're using. And how do you do that? Well, like I said, action verbs. They're your best friends, so please do use them. And so, to follow action verbs and to follow a lot of what we saw, revision. I know you guys are going to revise your essays. You guys are smart, young individuals. You guys all know that you're not just going to write your essay and then turn it in without looking at it. You're going to go through and revise many times. But revision and the revision process might look a little bit different than what you think. Because I know sometimes people they revise it themselves, especially people who are maybe scared to share their writing. But one thing, and as you can see from the tip, is the more people that review your writing, the better. So use Education USA, the resources they have, the advisors they have, those consulting periods that they have. Go through with them. Go through your essay with them. Go through your essay with other individuals who obviously know English, but can understand what you're saying and see if it's an effective paper. The more people who see your paper, the better. Why? Because you get as much feedback as possible on your paper, and that's what we want to do. is get a lot of feedback so that then we understand, okay, where can I improve and what things work really well. And the reason this is important is because think about it this way. When the admissions team sees your paper for the first time, they don't know who you are. They have no really background information. Maybe they quickly read your application, but for the most part, they know nothing about you. So they're reading your paper with a fresh pair of eyes and, well, not fresh pair of ears because I guess they're not listening, but fresh pair of eyes. And they're looking at it for the very first time. And so they're learning all of these new things about you. So you should do the same during your revision process. Maybe find somebody who speaks English who doesn't know you and have them read your paper. Why? Because then they can tell you afterwards, they can repeat back to you what they understood, what they didn't understand, and what did they come to know more about you. And then that shows if your narrative slash story was effective. Because if I give the same person who already knows me really well the same paper to look at 3 times, and then after the 3rd time, they're going to say, yeah, it's good. Okay, awesome. Well, duh, they also know you already. Give it to someone also who maybe doesn't know you, but can obviously read the paper in English, because then you can really see if your writing's effective because they know nothing about you. And so they're going to read your paper and they'll tell you afterwards what they understood and what they didn't. And the parts that they didn't is a clear way for you to understand, okay, I need to go back and fix this, because that's what's going to exactly happen with the admissions team. Now, the second part of that advice and tip, which you guys saw, and I put the however, is in the revision process. I know, and I do this all the time because I also sometimes fall into this trap of maybe there's the perfect way to say something, but there isn't. There is no one approach to how you need to write, how you need to say things, how you need to do things. Writing is very complex, but it's also very diverse. Everybody's going to have a different writing style, and also the things you're going to say are going to be so different. And so in the revision process, when you're getting feedback from people, the biggest thing I want you guys to remember, though, is don't lose your own voice in the process. Because it's easy for us to have a lot of people review our things, or if we're working with just one advisor. I have one of my favorite advisors at my university, Dr. Dow. I am in his office all the time when I'm writing essays. But one of the things I know not to do is he gives me great advice. He will tell me exactly what he thinks, how maybe I can word something better. But it's important for me to take in his feedback, but not just copy his feedback necessarily. Why? Because then it turns into a paper of Dr. Dow and not Vlad Wallace. And that's something you want to make sure you don't do, is you don't lose your voice. Because if you lose your voice, then the paper isn't you anymore. It's somebody else, or it's 1,000 people behind the paper, and you don't want that. Get feedback, get criticism, get advice, but also make sure that you're still sticking to your narrative. Remember, I'm underlying you here because it's your story, and nobody else can tell your story better than you. And so although people can give you that feedback and those tips, they can't write the essay for you, even though maybe we want them to. And believe me, at the end of the day, even though you think that maybe some doctor candidate at Harvard University who's just looked over your paper and has told you you need to write it like this, although that might be effective, at the end of the day, admissions teams also are very well trained. They have very well trained eyes, and they understand when somebody maybe has compromised their work. And it's not saying you cheated, because you obviously didn't cheat, but what I mean by compromised your work is they understand it's not just your narrative anymore. It's maybe you and your advisor's narrative, which isn't so good. You want to make sure it's a concise, uniform narrative of you. So I can't stress that enough. But don't be afraid. Please share your essay as many times as possible with a bunch of people, because readers are your resource, and they're your friends, and they're there to help you. So my next bit of advice is be unique. Now, what does this mean? Obviously, this probably sounds very general to you, but when you're going and revising and trying to make your story your personal story, you have to make it and include details about you, obviously, but you have to make it as specific as possible to you. Why? Because the more specific, and specific here is just another way of saying unique, the more specific you are, the better story it's going to be, because it is then more of a personal statement. And that's why it's called a personal statement, is it has to be specific details about you. And so the issue with that is sometimes people say things that sound great, but I could say the same thing to like 1,000 people. And so it doesn't include a few specific details that make it specifically what they did. So I included an example here. So example one is, I worked at an international organization to learn more about international initiatives. It's very generic, it's very broad, it's very general. And I could say the same thing, and anybody here could include this exact same sentence in their essay. Anybody. There's nothing specific, unique, or anything about this. Now, if I say something like, I worked with Education USA in Almaty, Kazakhstan to better understand the different education initiatives that the Department of State pursues in Central Asia. This has more detail and it's more specific. Not everybody is going to have spent time with an organization maybe like Education USA. Not everybody's going to have time to, or will have probably said that they did something specifically related to Kazakhstan or Almaty or the State Department or Central Asia or specifically education initiatives. So those are things you want to do that make your sentences more unique and more specific. Remember, I said we want to be to the point and our word choice is important. We also want to make sure that we include those specific words, adjectives, details that best tell our story. Because, and as you can see from the tip, your personal statement is your personal narrative. And I can't stress the word personal enough here, because if I can take your story and literally just take out your name and write my name in there, and it still fits things that I've done, it's not specific enough. And I recommend you guys to use that approach. So when you go through in the revision process, play around with it and see if you took out your name and you put in my name or Donna's name or whoever else's name, your sister's name, your parents' name, could it still be a way to describe them? If so, your paper is not specific enough and it doesn't describe specifically what you are doing. Because not everybody does the same things, but sometimes when we write essays, we use very generic sentences that sound okay, but they're just that. They're okay and they're generic and they're not specific examples of what we have done. And we want to avoid that as much as possible because I don't want you guys just writing very generic things. And it's easy to fall in this trap, I think, especially as a foreigner, because of the command of the language probably. I think some sentences will sound perfectly fine to you and you don't think about the fact that maybe it's not specific enough. And two, it's hard as a foreigner because sometimes you're like, well, what else can I include? And maybe you just don't know. And that's okay. It's obviously a challenge. It's a work in progress. But that's why we're here to tell you these things, is because so you guys at least think about them when you're writing. So very important to do. Lastly, and my last bit of advice before we can go into more questions and more of a kind of dialogue and discussion with you guys, to craft a strong personal statement. And I said this actually with the recommendation letters for those who were here on Monday, is I need you and I want you to show, not tell. And the reason that is important is don't just say that you have these leadership qualities, these attributes, these characteristics. I don't want you just to have to tell me those things and me take your word for it, because I don't know you. And although I would like to believe you're credible and that I can believe your word, actions, we have this saying, we say actions speak louder than words. And that's true. And so use that saying in your writing. Show me, give me concrete examples. Don't just tell me. And when we were talking about those recommendation letters on Monday, I was saying how you want to make sure your recommendation letter writer doesn't just say things, but they give specific concrete examples of things you've done. That's the same thing that you need to do for yourself. So just like getting your writer to do it, you need to do it in your paper. And so just to guys give you an example of what show, don't tell looks like. If you say Michael was terribly afraid of the dark, okay, it's direct. The good thing is here, they used few words, so there's not too excessive. That's great. But they're just saying something. I haven't understood through action. I haven't been able to make my own conclusions. Whereas the second example, it goes like this. It says, as his mother switched off the light and left the room, so meaning as it got dark, Michael tensed. He huddled under the covers, gripped the sheets, and held his breath as the wind brushed past the curtain. This gives somebody the feeling that, okay, Michael is scared because of the things going on, but he hasn't explicitly said the word terrified, afraid, scared. And that is what effective writing is as well, is although you're going to be direct, you also want to use concrete examples that say these qualities that you're trying to say. So you don't have to say necessarily that you're a leader, if you've given me a description about the time you were managing an organization, I will then, through that description, understand that you're a leader. So something just to think about. Just think about that when you're doing that, because that's really important. And you want to be able to show and not tell with your examples, because then the committee will be so much more thankful to you guys. They'll say, wow, they told me a story. And a story tells through examples, not just by words, because words are meaningless if they don't really have meaning behind them. So my tip, as you guys can see at the bottom, is effective writing does not require you to explicitly state all the excellent traits you exude. So explicitly here meaning you don't actually have to say the specific thing. We can understand it / infer it through a description. And that's what it says here is instead, the reader can infer or kind of conclude by themselves what traits you demonstrate by a thorough yet succinct, brief description. And so while you want to include those details, like I said, you're going to be concise, you're going to be effective with your language, you're going to use those action verbs to have effective word choice. But you want to show. And at the end, hopefully, when you see at the end of your writing and you've used all of these tips, you will hopefully see that actually you are doing a lot of showing and not telling if you listen to all the other tips that I've given before this last one. And so these are all the things that I have done during my writing processes, and they're things that I still use right now. I mean, I'm getting ready to apply for fellowship programs for grad school, everything else. And I'm in the process of starting my personal statements, my essays right now. And one of the things that helped me most, like I said, is always having a personal statement ready to go. Not because I'm going to turn in that exact copy, but because I get to skip the first piece of advice that I gave you guys, which is write. Why? Because I already have a base to start with, and then I can work from there. So use these tips, use these pieces of advice to your advantage. You don't have to use all of them if you don't want to. If there was one you just absolutely hated and don't agree with me, that's fine. But think about these things when you're writing, because it's really important for you to craft an effective personal statement. What is a fellowship? A fellowship is basically like a scholarship program. It's just a little bit more involved. It might include an internship. It also pays for your study or whatever you're doing. That's what a fellowship is. Can I write about traumatic event in the personal statement, or is it not advisable? No, please do. Again, remember, if you remember when I went on the first slide, it said by the narrative section, one of the two things it said were challenges and interests. And one of the biggest components of your letter is your challenges. Maybe you've achieved a lot of great things, but it wasn't easy because of a challenge that you faced, And that's something to think about, is maybe there was a traumatic event in your life that was really difficult for you. So for me, one thing I remember when I was in high school, so my father passed away when I was in 8th grade. So I wasn't applying to colleges, obviously, until 4 years later, 3 years later. And that was a really traumatic event for me and for my family and everything else. But I, afterwards, obviously, 3 years had passed and I was way more comfortable about talking about it. And with time, things heal, right? And so in my letter, I talked about all the things I did, but I mentioned that I did these things in the face of adversity. And adversity, in this case, being a traumatic family death, things that affected me and would have directly affected my ability to be engaged academically, socially, professionally, getting involved in organizations. I could have just gone into depression and not done any of these things, but instead I still pushed forward and I fought. And so, Saya, I do recommend to include those kinds of events. Now, my caveat / bit of advice is, when you include those events, don't just make your paper a sob story. Everybody has their fair share of what they call traumatic events. Nobody is unique in the sense that they don't have any hardships, but don't make your whole paper about hardships. Remember, it's about what you've achieved, so you can use those hardships to better underline what you've achieved and how much you've accomplished, but don't let those hardships define your entire paper, if that makes sense. They shouldn't be the only focus, but do include them. If I am going to write about me overcoming bullying, is it a good one? Yeah, that's also a challenge that you have faced. That is other hardships that people face. How did you overcome that? What did you learn through the process? Why does that experience connect to what you want to do now. Maybe somebody who's overcome bullying wants to go into social work. You know, that is a great way for somebody to say, well, I have experienced things that other children might experience, whether it's in school or at home. And I want to be able now, as somebody who's overcome this challenge, to be able to give other people the help they need to also overcome such a challenge. Any challenge is fair game, you know, and there isn't one challenge that is better than another. You know, you can't say that the death of one person is better or worse than a family going bankrupt and living on the street. You know, we don't compare those things. We don't say, oh yeah, that sounds so much better. That's wrong, kind of to say. We don't do that, but generally sit down and think about a challenge that has affected you and has impacted you in a strong way, and see what how you can incorporate that, and how that better tells your story slash narrative. What are some cliche personal statements that make the committees groan? How to avoid them? I think the most cliche things, remember when I said those very generic sentences that are not unique enough? I think that's what make them groan the most. So you have now written, I don't know how long your personal statement limits are, but let's say they give you a limit of 600 words, because some of mine right now are 600 words. Let's say I only use generic, very vague sentences and they're not specific or unique to me or about detailed things. That's what makes them groan the most, because they have now wasted their time. They just read a 600 word essay about life, not about me, not about what I've achieved, but life. Because why? They can basically, that essay could be written by anybody because it's so general. And so those are probably the most cliche things, are when you don't make something very specific to you. So the way to avoid that is to use as really as effective detail as possible. And I use effective detail because not as much detail as possible, because if it becomes too wordy, then you also lose them. But if it's strategic details that tell exactly what you're trying to say with few words, it's perfect, because then it's specific to you, it's concise, and it's easier for the reader then to say, wow, in 600 words, I know this, and this about this applicant. Wow, they're an amazing communicator in written format, and that's great. So that's something to think about. Should I write about my childhood if I'm applying to graduate school? I mean that many books and articles require to write more about research, your academic life. So for graduate programs, I think they are a bit different, because for undergrad, you're writing about your high school time and everything before then. And while you obviously can still include things from your childhood, especially if they've had a massive impact on you, for graduate school, they want to know what you've done. So think about it this way. This is not in absolute terms, but once you're in, you start your undergraduate program, you start on a fresh page. So everything you've done before then, it doesn't disappear necessarily, but it doesn't really matter as much anymore, in the sense that not like those traumatic events, but more the things that you did in high school and all of that. Why? Because that was for high school and that was to help you get into your college time. Now graduate schools want to know on your 4-year or 5-year paper of your undergraduate experience, what research did you do? What did you do during your professional time? All of those things. That's what they want to know, and that's really important. You can include a childhood event if it is something that has directly impacted you and the research that you're doing now. Otherwise, if it's just something to talk about a challenge that you face as a little kid, I mean, it's not bad, but it might not necessarily pertain to the topic. So I think for graduate programs and applications, it's a little bit more tricky. So if there's a specific childhood event that just in general was kind of difficult, but it doesn't relate to what you want to study or anything else, I might not necessarily include it. Now, for example, I know that graduate applications ask about financial hardships people face. That's something that could have been from your entire childhood. Maybe your family wasn't maybe the wealthiest family for most of your childhood time. And that's something to highlight, because then that shows that you have a unique challenge that you have to face, and maybe you need extra funding, or maybe you need help and you've overcome so much. So those are the things you want to definitely think about when you're thinking about what types of experiences to include, especially for graduate programs. Is being quirky in your essay an absolute necessity for success? Since, as I noticed, majority of the IV and T20 essays usually, or Tier 20, usually start with extremely detailed descriptions of some weirdly specific things. I will say that, so you guys had that webinar, I believe, with the hook sentence and the intro paragraph, or maybe it was just the hook sentence. Your intro paragraph, a lot of times, especially for undergraduate programs, does need to catch the reader's attention. And the way people do that is making the start of those essays very quirky and really weirdly specific things. And that's a great way to actually put it. It is weirdly specific, but weirdly specific translates to unique. Why? Because remember when I said if something's not specific enough, you could just put anybody else's name there and it would still match their description. And that's why people use those weirdly specific things. Now, it's not an absolute necessity to include some weird or strange, quirky thing, as long as you're effectively telling your story. But most people find that if they include that weird, quirky thing in their life, it tells their story because it's so unique to them that nobody else could possibly ever mention that. So if you do underwater basket weaving and you talk about that, how many people do you know who've ever done underwater basket weaving, Oksana? I don't know anybody. So if somebody starts their essay with that, I'm automatically like, whoa, that's different, that's weird. And I think that's really specific also, though, to Ivy League programs. Like I said, people who are applying to the Ivy League specifically, they meet a lot of the technical requirements. And so those qualitative requirements, like a personal statement, recommendation letter, are so much more important because that's what help you set yourself apart. And so sometimes you have to include those specific things, but I don't think it's necessarily a necessity. I wouldn't say that, but I know that's approach most people take because it's the easiest approach, if that makes sense. There's not just one formula that you have to use, but that's what people use because they think that's what results for the most creative paper for them. Is it okay to not write about a specific event? There are cases when something follows a person for a long time throughout the years. Example, I have a friend talking about struggle with his identity. He has a certain label on him, but is not offensive or anything, so he doesn't face a specific event or series of events that affected him. So you don't need to talk about specific just challenges necessarily if you don't have one in mind. You can talk about other things, but if you have a challenge, it's okay to talk about it, and that's what we mean. Now, for your friend in this case, it says he has a specific label, struggle with his identity. Well, if, for example, you have somebody who's maybe transgender or transsexual that struggles with their identity, and they want to talk about that in their paper, they're more than welcome to talk about that. Why? Because that is a struggle or challenge that they have faced, and they talk about how they went through that process and have overcome it, and they still achieved XYZ in their high school or university time. And that's great because it tells their story and it's still specific to them. Now, if they don't want to choose that to talk about that, by all means, they don't have to. You know, like I said, your challenges shouldn't define who you are or what your paper is about. They are a way to highlight certain things, but they're not everything. So this isn't a paper about challenges. It's a paper about you. But a portion of us is our challenges. Our challenges make us who we are, but they don't define us completely, if that makes sense. My question is a bit out of topic. If I have just 3-4 extracurriculars that I do with passion, will it be bad for my application? Because I often see people making 8 to 9 activities. Actually, I think you're doing everything right, and those people who are doing 8 to 9 activities are doing everything wrong. Why do I say that? Well, that's because how involved can somebody be in 8 to 9 activities? Realistically speaking, if I say I'm the leader of 8 to 9 different organizations, even, how feasible do you think it is for me to really dedicate 30 hours a week to each of those activities? I can't. No, time is limited. So you doing 3 to 4 select things, and I would even say maybe 2 to 3 is even better to mention in detail, because I don't need to see 9 different things because then it's just a list of your resume. But if you talk about 2 to 3 concrete, detailed things that you're doing, even though maybe you do more, and you can mention them generally in your application, but in your paper, select only 2 to 3, because otherwise you run the risk of just basically doing a resume in a personal statement format, and we don't want that. So don't feel discouraged because you can include all the things you do in your application, but in your personal statement, only talk about a few in detail. Talk about the few that are the most important and that you're the most involved in. Because I know even in those 3 to 4 things, you obviously are not equally involved in all of them. So you don't dedicate 20 hours exactly to each one. Some maybe you do 5, some maybe you do 10, some maybe you do 15, you know? So that's something to think about. What if I had significant challenges in my life, but I don't want to write about them? They seem to be very suitable for personal statement. So should I write about them? Well, if you don't want to write about them, they don't know about them. They don't know what challenges you faced, and they don't know you. But if you think a challenge has had a significant impact on your life and was a big time for you, include it only because it probably does really well in highlighting challenges that you face, but also who you are and why you are who you are today. But if you don't want to include it, you don't have to. You know, nobody's going to literally hold a gun to your head and say, talk about your challenges right now. They're just gonna say, okay, well, what other ways can you tell us more about you? People use challenges because it's an easier way to discuss and talk about themselves. There are other ways to do it, but challenges are the easiest way to do it. And that's why people use them, is because it's the easier approach. It's like the less is more approach. It requires less effort, but it does the exact same thing. So you want to be strategic because you don't want to overburden yourself by trying to include all these things when you could have just included a challenge and it could have said the exact same thing, you know? So I hope that helps. Should I include some specific numbers in my personal statement? Because some people say that numbers are more for CVs, resumes. Is it right or not? So if I achieved some Olympiads at high school, I should not write about it. Numbers are amazing and they're also bad at the same time. They're amazing because they're really specific, but they're bad because they're also subjective and you can manipulate numbers and maybe they're hard to understand. But for the most part, I would say if you can use numbers, it's actually really good. Why? Because just like in your resume, when a potential employer is looking at you for a candidate for the job, they want to know specific concrete things. And to make something as concrete as possible, numbers are sometimes a great way to do that. So if you told me that you were leading a book club, right? Well, let's say you talk about this group, book club and all the challenges you faced as leading the book club, because there were a lot of different and diverse personalities in the book club, which made it really difficult to always agree on a book, something else, and you as a group leader had to be the one to navigate that situation. Well, if you tell the committee that there's 30 people specifically in that book club, that gives them a better understanding of how many people you are managing. That's good. That's a specific thing. Or your Olympiad, also good. If they want to know some specific things, like if you ranked #1 regionally, nationally, whatever, they want to know those things. So numbers are a great way to add specifics and details and uniqueness to your thing, actually. So don't think that you cannot not include them. Now, don't make your thing just a data paper. We don't want to see statistics here and there. Strategically use numbers where you can to give more detail, but don't just make your whole paper about numbers. What would you recommend for further reading to know more about writing personal statements? The best thing I would recommend for you guys to do, but also that I caution you to do, is read other personal statements. You can easily find 1,001 examples online. Read them, see what are deemed effective and strong, and that helps you get a better sense of how personal statements are written. But I caution you at the same time, because if you read so many, then you start to sound like those papers and not yourself, and then you lose your voice. As I said earlier, we don't want to do that. So that's something I would recommend there. Do you think applicants should create a certain image of themselves, present themselves in a certain way? People who want to major in computer science should put STEM, programming-related extracurriculars mostly, and then talk about similar topic in the personal statement to support the passion? Not necessarily, actually. I think the best thing that you can do is, although you should include mainly things that relate to your topic of study, the thing that's going to make you, Saya, stand out the most is if somebody who's going into computer science also talks about some really personal or random thing that they did that is still useful and that still taught you a lot. You know, not everything needs to be STEM related for you to have learned a skill that can still help you in STEM. So if you're a strong communicator because you led some organization that wasn't STEM related, that still is useful because you have leadership qualities that will help you in STEM, you know? So you can include mainly those extracurriculars, but do weave in something that is not directly STEM related. Why? Because it tells more about your personality. You're not 100% STEM, you're a person. You know, you're not a robot. We want to know, and they want to know, the admissions team wants to know more about you, and the best way to do that is give them a variety of examples of different things. Because if you just list each STEM thing after STEM thing, that's great. But everybody's going to do that. And so how do you set yourself apart? Well, include the STEM thing, then include something not STEM, then maybe STEM again, then something else that's not STEM. And I think that approach would work. Can I write about my first traveling experience? Because I had some adventurous situations at that time. Yeah, that's a travel experience is great. You know, when people said, when Oksana, going back to that quirky thing, a travel experience might have been something that is very specific or random or weird, or maybe just normal, but something you experienced that led you to something else. Those are what I mean by challenges, quirkiness, experiences. Choose an experience that has helped you get to where you are and talk about it, because then it helps make your narrative very personal and very specific. How can we connect with the admissions officers? Should we seem relatable or woo them with something special, quirky, impressive? I'm going to answer the second question first before the second part, before the first part. Don't ever write your essay when just sitting there thinking what's going to woo them, you know, because then you're literally probably going to write something that they're going to see and they're going to say, okay, this person is just listing off achievements, blah, blah, blah. You need to tell a story. You need to talk about the process through which you learned and the experiences that helped you learn what you learned. Not necessarily saying, oh, I did this thing and it was so amazing because I was recognized for this or that. Include those things, but don't make it everything, because then they're just going to think, okay, this person is just including titles and big names. Getting the director of your school, although the title seems impressive, is not necessarily the best thing. And so that's the same thing with this. Don't necessarily choose just the thing that you think sounds the most impressive. Choose the thing that you really can talk about and that speaks to you as a person the best, because that will shine through in the essay. And I guarantee you, because a personal statement is, again, it's a personal statement. And on your application, you're going to already include those really impressive, those amazing things. But the fact that you chose to spend the limited 600 words that you have to repeat those amazing things that are already listed on your application is a little silly, because I already read your application and I understood that you did those amazing things. So why do I have to go again? And the 600 words, the limited space that you had, you chose to just repeat it. Now, if it's something specific you want to highlight, good, but don't highlight everything again. That 600 words is sometimes your one opportunity. It's basically, think about it this way. If you don't have an interview with the admissions team, your essay is your interview. So you have everything already written down, but it's your one time as if you were sitting in front of them to tell your story in 600 words. And so you have to do that and include as many things as possible to give your story the best way possible.